Occult just means hidden. Occulta, hidden. Some can take this to mean that what we do, those who are interested in the occult are doing things hidden or away from the public in a way that the only way to operate is in secrecy. This might be true, however, it could also mean that perhaps those who are interested in the occult are interested in something that has been hidden from us, that there is a knowledge available somehow that can show us the true nature of, well, everything, that the explanations that we have for this life and this world aren't actually available to us, not unless we find a different way of getting different information. Through the ages, many have tried. Who's to say who got closer to the great hidden, that tasted this great unknown, if only even for a second? And the rest, well, that is up for debate. But for sure audacity and blazing originality, one name has always come up, and that is Dr. John Dee. Welcome back to the Fool's Gallery. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and this is What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. When I first started this podcast, I did want to have a specific section where I talk about individuals who have added their own special something to the occult. And I've talked about this every time a Fool's Gallery comes up. But the name Fool's Gallery came from me thinking a lot about these individuals, the ones that we can see had an impact on the world of magic. What would I call this group of people? Things like the Rogues Gallery that came to mind, but didn't seem right. And then I got thinking about who exactly do I really want to talk about? And up at the top of that was John Dee. It was actually John Dee who I had specifically in mind when I wanted to name these episodes The Fool's Gallery. Because as great as they are, and as many wonderful things as they do, there's always something about them that seems somewhat brazen and downright foolish. John Dee is a titan of magic. Perhaps he is the titan of magic of all of them. I've talked about Eliphas Levi, I've talked about Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, but I think John Dee has them all beat. If people even have a simple or rudimentary knowledge of the occult or of magic, and you're asked to name one famous occultist or magician, or even a real-life wizard, these days it will be one of two people, either Aleister Crowley or John Dee. There is a kind of story or a book. It's called a hagiography. Now, these are stories of the life and deeds of a saint, of a Catholic saint. Hagiographies came up out of the stories that were told about two saints in particular. That would be St. Anthony and St. Martin of Tours. Now, the huge literary tradition that surrounded these saints and just retelling their life over and over again, this became a template for all the hagiographies that were to follow. I would argue that the life of John Dee is pretty much a hagiographic template for the life of a renowned magician. They have an interesting upbringing, brilliance as an early adult, notoriety, rejection of some sort, which leads them to concentrate on their own magical work, unreal and crazy experiences, then ultimately being unable to return to any semblance of normality until fading, a slow and somewhat agonizing slide into quiet obscurity for the last years of their life, only to be rediscovered and cherished again after shuffling off this mortal coil. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as I often do. I will say this. In this episode, I want to take as a motto the same motto which appears on John Dee's coat of arms. Veritas praevalebat. The truth will prevail. Who was John Dee? Well, he was an Anglo-Welsh mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, alchemist, occultist, and magician. He was mainly active in the 16th century in England. He was alive during the reign of 5 English monarchs, which would be Henry VIII, his very sickly son Edward, Mary I, Elizabeth I, and James I. Living a long and turbulent life, 81 years, he is without a doubt the closest that the Western world has come to the purest definition of a wizard. Since the publication of Merrick Casaubon's work, A True and Faithful Relation of What Passed for Many Years Between John Dee and Some Spirits, 50 years after his death, he has never not been pondered over, obsessed over, and examined with and without scrutiny. To the prevailing paradigm, he was a scholar and mathematician that helped shape Renaissance ideas in England and thus paved the way for established science, as well as politically advised the creation of English colonies in North America. To others, he is the man who, with the help of a somewhat shady assistant, and for a short period of time, was in conversation and guidance of a pristine and complex magical system which allowed him to converse with celestial intelligences and angels. He was both, certainly, and he was more. The name Dee is Welsh for black. John Dee was born in London, we think, in July of 1527. He was the son of a courtier of Henry VIII. Dee later claimed that he was a descendant of a Welsh king, whose kingdom was a Roman successor state called Glywynedd. Not long after birth, John Dee was baptized at the church St. Dunstan's in the East. Now, this church is still kind of standing, in a way, in London. If you live in London itself, head there. It's going to be hard to avoid people taking selfies and Instagram story posts because it is a really lovely church. It was bombed out during World War II, and I believe it was also damaged at some point in the Great London Fire, although I could be wrong about that. But it's a wonderful place to stay. My very last day of being in London in 2018, I spent most of the afternoon just sitting there reading with some books I bought from Treadwell's bookshop. But also, if you live in London and you head to that church, have a look around for the tombstones, which at certain points make up the cobblestones of the church, and try and find Nicholas Batchelor. Anyways, Dee was a quiet child, but very intelligent. He attended various schools, including Cambridge, where he became one of the original fellows of Trinity College, which was set up by Henry VIII. John Dee excelled at mathematics and was recognized for his brilliance. But one instance in particular sticks out from his time at Cambridge, which involved him creating a wooden mechanical beetle that was to be used during the production of a Greek play. Now, the beetle did several things I've read, miraculous things that supposedly this beetle did. But the big thing to keep in mind here is that apparently it made people think that John Dee was a black magician or a wizard or a sorcerer in some way, something that he would never, ever get rid of. Dee traveled around Europe, doing that hoovering up of knowledge about mathematics and astronomy, as well as astrology. I'm not going to go into it too much, but other biographies talk about his time traveling around Europe when he was younger. But what is to be known is that Dee stood out and excelled at whatever he did early on in his life and his adulthood. John Dee lived in, well, what could be called tumultuous times, to say the least. If there is one thing that astounds me about John Dee, is that he lived past the age of 32 without being killed. There were many things happening in England, including the Protestant Reformation and the formation of the Church of England by Henry VIII, and the attempted reversal of the Protestant Reformation in English by Queen Mary I, otherwise known to history as Bloody Mary. Now, this is a thing that has been happening over the last little while is there's a bit more of a reexamination of the time when Queen Mary was the reigning monarch of England. So let me talk about it for a little bit. Now, this time is known for a lot of burning Protestants. What occurred after Mary passed away was that the Protestants started to do their own reassessment of history. And I think in a way, they exaggerated a lot of what occurred during Mary's reign. That is not to say that burning did not happen. Burning certainly did. And it wasn't exclusive to England. That was happening over a lot of places in Europe. There are stories, however, by historians, particularly Protestant historians, of things that they would do while burning people. I'm not too sure how factually correct this is, but I'm going to tell this story anyway, that sometimes to switch things up a bit and to keep things fresh when there would be the burning of Protestants is that they would tie a collar filled with gunpowder around the neck of the person being burned. So eventually, as the flames started to rise, it would set off the gunpowder and cause the person being burned, well, it would cause their head to explode. People who are fans of the 80s comedian Gallagher no doubt can see some kind of similarities, except in this case, instead of watermelons, it would be bits of skull and brain matter and sinuous tissue, splattering all of those with front row tickets. Now, the picture painted by Protestant historians after Mary is one of complete brutality. But as I said, we have been receiving a more nuanced picture of Bloody Mary and what she actually got up to. Truthfully, she burnt less than 300 people during her time as monarch. Again, burning of Protestants was somewhat common in Europe. It still doesn't make it right, but considering that her father, Henry VIII, sentenced 57,000 people to death, Mary has nothing on her dad. But again, brutal nevertheless. Whether the histories written of this time, predominantly by the Protestants talking after who definitely had a hatred of Catholicism within England, and a lot of these books, if you go and look them up, they have illustrations of the Protestants being burned, and they're really quite gruesome. Yeah, they're a bit much. But at base, this period of time was certainly not a good time for anybody who stood out in any way. John Dee himself, he didn't consider himself a true Catholic, not in the high European way. He kind of was able to slither and shift his religious allegiances depending on who was in power at the time, an act of magic almost in and of itself. But in 1555, John Dee was charged with calculating. What this means is that he was found to have cast horoscopes for Queen Mary as well as Queen Mary's half-sister, Elizabeth. If this was not stressful enough, charges were raised to treason. Since his days at Cambridge and since his travels in Europe, his reputation had always preceded him, and he had to appear in the Star Chamber in an attempt to exonerate himself. How he managed not to be burnt is shocking to me, but he must have had some kind of cunning as well as being well-spoken, for he later became an associate of one of his Catholic examiners, which, for a time, was fine, until Mary I died and Catholics were back to being rife for persecution. It is boggling that John Dee made it through this somewhat, although not entirely unscathed. Not wasting any time, Dee became allied with the new monarch, which would have been Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Dee became a bit of her go-to astrologer as well as an advisor on certain scientific matters. Dee became a person to know. But shortly after Queen Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth, poof, Dee vanishes. Just like a stage magician, he's gone. He is absent from all historical records for 5 years. We can assume that at this time he spent a lot of it collecting books for his library, which would become, by most accounts, one of the greatest personal libraries in all of Europe. When he surfaced again, he became somewhat interested in attempting to bend the ear of the Queen to be able to put much more interest in building ships and financing voyages to the Americas and elsewhere. This put him in company with another wizard by the name of Humphrey Gilbert, who I have talked about on several shows, as well as his brother Adrian and Sir Philip Sidney. Much as he tried, Dee was viewed with ambivalence by many within Elizabeth's circle and by Elizabeth herself at times. Little of what he said was adopted, some of what he advised was completely shut down, and much of what he did or tried to do was soundly ignored. For more detail of John Dee's political and advisory shenanigans, there's a book put out, it was a couple of years ago, I believe, by Glenn Perry, and it is called The Arch-Conjurer of England. It is perhaps my favorite biography of John Dee. It's pretty light on the magic, but it's still just a fantastic way of trying to understand what was going on around England at the time, but also more specifically in Elizabeth's court. John Dee also wrote a book called Hieroglyphica, which is a pseudo-hermetic work in which the unity of all knowledge could be exemplified in one sigil of Dee's creation. This is a very strange book, and I've read it, and I fully admit I understand very little of it. Feeling ignored more and more within the circles in which he felt that he should excel, and never really getting patronage from the Queen or anybody else, really, John Dee did what any person should do in their middle age, and that's more magic. He began attempting to converse with angels via the use of a scryer. Now, scrying, we'd like to think, is one of those things that maybe John Dee came up with. That's not entirely so. There were people beforehand, more specifically Trithemius of Spondheim. It spread all across Europe, and it was one of those things where it was seen as being able to contact intelligences outside of what we would normally consider things like spirits, more so things like angels. And it was incredibly popular. Eventually, scrying became seen as being a bit of a scam. I'll just put it that way. Now, John Dee, he attempted to scry at several points and found that he was terrible at receiving any messages at all. So he needed somebody else to help him out in this regard. Through his life, I believe he used about 4 scryers. That one would be Barnabas Saul, one was Bartholomew Hickman, who he eventually used later on in life. The other was his son, and then there was another gentleman that I will talk about shortly. Now, the first 3 that I listed to help Dee in his efforts for scrying, he was dissatisfied with pretty much all of them. That is until he met Edward Talbot in 1582. Dee was blown away by Talbot's abilities. Eventually, Talbot said that, well, by the way, my name's actually Edward Kelley. Edward Talbot was something I adopted because I'll explain later. Dee and Kelley began an arduous process that kept getting refined as time went on. Their scrying became more complex and more complete. The both of them were convinced that they were indeed talking to celestial intelligences and angels. A year later, Dee and Kelley, having met a Polish noble named Albert Lasky, and being prompted by the angels, decided to pack up and take both of their families to Europe, living nomadically, and maybe with a bit of spying thrown in. Maybe. This is where the majority of Dee and Kelley's angel scrying took place while traveling around Europe. It culminated in a vast array of books, each one more complex than the last, most of them very detailed and always confounding. They also began to try and court royals such as Rudolph II and King Stephen of Poland. But Dee's earlier ties to Queen Elizabeth made him rife for rumors of being a spy, which he probably was. Well, he definitely was. Dee also tried convincing these royals of his very, very important work communicating with angels. Many ignored John Dee, but not his assistant, Edward Kelley, who convinced many that he was a powerful and efficient alchemist. Then the thing happened. The thing. In 1587, during a scrying session, one of the angels, Uriel, told Kelley to tell Dee that they have to share absolutely everything between each other, including their wives. This was heartbreaking to Dee, but he complied, much to the disgust of his wife. Kelley's alchemy reputation gained more and more traction in the following months. Dee and his family were becoming more and more miserable. Dee wanted the complete attention of Kelley and their angelic conversations, but Kelley was making good coin with nobles and royalty in Central Europe. Kelley became the official alchemist for Rudolph II. Dee was gifted with the birth of a son. Well, I'm not saying that it's impossible, but with the wife swapping that did occur, Kelley was 32 at the time, and John Dee was nearly 60. Dee had had enough, and he decided to return to England with his family in 1589. Upon returning home, his house in Mortlake on the River Thames, where he had his vast library, was pilfered for anything valuable, many books stolen, as well as equipment smashed and stolen. In the 6 years he had been away, the occult and magic was becoming less popular and viewed with more suspicion. Dee was at an all-time low, having returned to England. Still thinking he was somewhat chummy with the Queen, he asked for her help in some way, and she appointed him a warden of Christ's College in Manchester in 1595, which might have been a way of protecting him or just brushing him off. Dee's time in Manchester was unfruitful. He was treated with a bit of disdain, as well as cheated at some points by a lot of his associates, but he was happy at least to be working. Now, somewhere in this time, we believe from 1591 to 1607, Dee was scrying intermittently with another man, Bartholomew Hickman, who he had an association with before as a scryer, before he eventually went with Edward Kelley. Now think about this. If he was scrying with Dee all of this time, 1591 to 1607, this timescale is longer than that with Edward Kelley. But next to nothing of these sessions survive, which is beyond a shame. Who knows what they found? Dee and family returned to London in 1605. By this point, Queen Elizabeth had passed away, and the new monarch, James I, wanted absolutely fucking nothing to do with John Dee. Dee began to sell off as many of his possessions as he could to just be able to feed himself and his daughter Catherine, who loved and cared for him as his long-suffering wife Jane was dead. One of the final angelic interactions that we have a record of was between John Dee and the angel Raphael. It told Dee, "Thou shalt take a long journey in hand, and when thou art at the journey's end, amongst friends beyond these seas, as thou knowest, God shall and will raise thee as faithful friends." Dee began to prepare for this journey by locking some of his books in a secret compartment in a chest and buried other books in a field around his property at Mortlake. But this journey was to never happen. Little is known of the last days of John Dee. He passed away either in December of 1605 or March of 1609. A couple of things happened after. Sometime between 1610 and 1620, an antiquarian named Sir Robert Cotton excavated the fields around John Dee's property at Mortlake. His reasons for doing so are unknown, but he found John Dee's documents, which were badly damaged but still readable. These documents would later be given to Merrick Casaubon, who would then use them to write the true and faithful relation between John Dee and several spirits, which opined that Dee was tricked by demons through all of his angelic interactions. But it is still an incredible document nevertheless, and you can find it and you can read it, and it's very, very interesting. But also, in 1642, a wooden chest that Robert Jones had purchased 20 years before, which had belonged to a well-known surgeon, was being moved in his house. While moving it, Jones noticed a sound inside the chest, and he pried it open. Inside, they found strange documents. These would be some of John Dee's most prized manuscripts. The papers, they went on a bit of a wild and wacky journey. I'm not going to get into it too much, but it included things like surviving the fire of London. But eventually they found their way to lawyer and collector of strange documents, Elias Ashmole. Between these two incredible finds, the legend of John Dee, Edward Kelley, and their angelic conversations was just getting started. So, for the remainder of the episode, what is going to happen is that I'm going to split it up into 4 easy-to-follow segments for everybody, all right? These segments are going to be the myths, the magic, the message, and finally, the man. So let's start with myths. You bring up the name of John Dee, And you will hear many things, many things, that he did stuff with angels, that he was a genius, etc., etc. You will also hear a lot of things that are myths, complete myths. So in this one, I want to go through a few of these because sometimes these are the first things that you will hear about John Dee. So everybody take a breath. It's going to be okay. And yes, don't send me any hate mail. So let's start with an easy one, a relatively easy Band-Aid to pull off for everybody. And it shouldn't be too much of a letdown. The coronation of Elizabeth I. It is said that John Dee was consulted to find the date for Queen Elizabeth's coronation, for when the crown would be put on her head and England will rejoice for their new monarch. John Dee never did this. The Privy Council had picked the date of coronation well beforehand, and somebody went to John Dee and just basically said, "Is this okay astrologically?" And John Dee brought out his maps and tables. He's like, "Yep, looks good. Everything looks fine." And that was that. So yes, no, he did not pick the date of Elizabeth's coronation. Here's another one that you might hear. John Dee was never a member of Elizabeth I's court. Some people will say that, oh, he's a member of the court. He was in there. He was mixing it up with everybody. No, he was not a courtier. While he did have an advisory role in some respects, mostly to do with maps and the like. In fact, John Dee actually drew one of the first maps of North America for Queen Elizabeth. It might have been the first map of North America for anybody in England. And he was also consulted for astrology as well. But a member of the court, he was not. No. Dee's relationship with the court of Elizabeth I was fraught. It was difficult, and it was a hell of a thing, and definitely worthy of examination. The Arch-Conjurer of England by Glyn Perry. It goes through all of it in depth. Please read that book. Now, here is a myth that you will hear constantly, all the time. And that is that John Dee was not only the basis for James Bond, but his signature that he used to sign letters to the Queen, which was a hand shading a pair of eyes, was the basis for the code 007. This is horseshit, all right? This idea comes from the author Donald McCormick in a book where he proclaims that John Dee was an Elizabethan spy, which is true. He did partake of the intelligence racket for Liz. He was a friend of Walsingham, all right, but none of his surviving correspondences have 007. He usually signs things with the Greek letter delta, which is a triangle, or in the document Harleian MS 6986 to Queen Elizabeth, he signed it merely John and then the letter D. That's it. That's all. Just like you would sign something these days. Donald McCormick is a weird character himself. Please check out his Wikipedia entry. It just goes through some of the odd claims that he has made, and that's about it. So we can put this one myth to bed. Just stop talking about it. John Dee did not sign his letters 007. If you are to go to the British Museum, there is an obsidian mirror that was apparently the property of John Dee. It has never conclusively shown to have belonged to John Dee at any point. It is probably attributed to John Dee after Casaubon's true and faithful relation, written 50 years after his death, and then things spiraled from there. Dee did have a crystal that was on a chain, which was apparently gifted to him by the angel Uriel. Dee gave this crystal to his son Arthur, who gave it to a physician and astrologer, Nicholas Culpeper, and it eventually made its way to the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum. But the mirror itself probably never used by Dee or even owned by Dee. In the British Museum, however, there are wax seals of the Sigillum Diameth, which I'm going to speak about a couple of times. If you look up John Dee sigil, this is the one that's going to come up. You've seen this before. If you're interested in magic, you've seen this before. It is one of the most recognizable magical symbols ever. Do a Google, look it up. You'll know what I'm talking about. But anyways, these were on wax, and they're about 2 to 3 inches tall. These wax seals that are in the British Museum, they were probably definitely John Dee's. So that, yes. The mirror, no. Okay, the big one. And it's a twofer. So John Dee, he did not coin the phrase the British Empire. 10 years before John Dee wrote anything about an empire, Humphrey Lloyd, who was a Welshman, wrote about it in one of his books. Now, people need to understand there was something going around at the time, certainly. The talk of empire and expansion was not just something being talked about in the court of Elizabeth and Mary, but it was also being talked about all over Europe. Dee, however, did write 8 documents which were presented to Queen Elizabeth between 1576 and 1578 about colonizing the New World and other parts of Europe, and some other extremely odd things which I don't really want to get into. Again, interaction with Liz's court were weird, and John Dee was a weird guy. But Dee's contribution to the English Empire is beyond minimal. He was not some evil colonial genius who gave Liz documents that would form the template for the British Empire henceforth. Upon giving these documents to the court, the reaction was this: Oh, cool. Didn't really ask. Well, sweet. Thank you so much. Cool. Don't call us. We'll call you. Thanks, John. Thank you. All right. Cheers. Bye-bye. That's all that happened. Glyn Perry, the author that I just brought up not too long ago in The Archconjurer of England, talks about this, as well as has a whole article about it that goes through absolutely everything. The main ambition of Elizabeth at this point was to try not to piss off the Spanish, which they eventually did anyways. Whoops. So those are some of the myths that are going to come up whenever John Dee's name is mentioned, and they are just that. They are myths. Let's talk about John Dee's magic. That's why you're all here, right? You want to know what the great wizard John Dee got up to. So I'm going to preface this whole section with an apology. I'm not going to get into the fine details of what is called Enochian magic. Sorry. John Dee never called his magic Enochian at any point. This kind of magic is a highly complex system which has evolved and been added to by the Golden Dawn and others through time. But the main reason I am not going to talk about it is because it is impossible to talk about it any way on a podcast that would make it interesting or at the least easy to comprehend. Truthfully, talking about the process itself would ultimately be boring. Yeah, there could be a whole podcast about Enochian magic. It's dense, it's deep, it's complex, as I said. Sure. Not sure if one exists. If one does, let me know. I'll put it in the show notes. But I'm not too sure how many people could take anything from me talking about Enochian magic. The mechanics are vast. You need to have tables and other visual things in front of you for it to make sense. It's a thing. It's a true thing. If there was one kind of magic that is in no way radio friendly, it is Enochian. I thought about it. I really, really did. I tried to figure out a way how to do it and present it, and I noped out very quickly. So sorry to disappoint everybody. If you think otherwise, fine. But if this was possible, it would merely mean that you, the listener, already know about Enochian magic, and I'm already telling you what you already know, and that wouldn't be pleasurable in any way, and it would ultimately be pointless. I'm trying to help those who have no basis on Enochian. Yeah, it's just too much. For things like the composition of the Sigillum de Ameth, to the watchtowers, to the Tablet of Union, trumpeters, ensign bearers, kings, cherubic angels, and on. There's just too much. And yeah, I'll bring the word up again. Complex. It's complex. Well, complex is an understatement. It's vast. But here's the thing. Complex does not mean deep. And it does not mean better. In most cases, it is the exact opposite. Dee came up with his system, from what we can understand, over a long period of time. Added to it, died, others found it, and did their own thing with it. So, if you are interested in Enochian magic, perhaps the best book about the progression of Enochian is from Egil Asperim. It is called Arguing with Angels. It is a fantastic book. Not enough people talk about this book. I think it's wonderful. If you are interested in Enochian magic, please read this book first. It blew me away, and while it also blew away many of the cobwebs of the questions that I had about Enochian magic. So look that up. Arguing with Angels by Egil Aspram. My outlook on Enochian magic and John Dee is pretty much the same as that of Alan Moore, who had this to say in his wonderful essay, Fossil Angels. I've talked about it at several points. It was a bombshell dropped into my magical pool, but here's what he has to say. John Dee, conversely, was perhaps more willfully awake than any other person of his day, more focused and more purposeful. He did not need to search for antecedents in the fictions and mythologies available to him, because John Dee was in no sense pretending. He was not playing games. He inspired, rather than was inspired by, the great magical fictions of his times. Dee's magic was a living and progressive force entirely of its moment, rather than some stuffed and extinct specimen, no longer extant save for histories or fairy tales. His was a fresh, rip-roaring chapter written entirely in the present tense of the ongoing magical adventure. By comparison, the occultists that followed some 3 centuries down the line were an elaborate appendix, or perhaps a bibliography after the fact, a preservation league, lip-syncing dead men's rituals, cover versions, sorceress karaoke. Magic, having given up or had usurped its social function, having lost its raison d'etre, its crowd-pulling star turn, found itself with just the empty theater, the mysterious curtains, dusty hampers of forgotten frocks, unfathomable props from cancelled dramas. Lacking a defined role, grown uncertain of its motivations, magic seems to have had no recourse save for sticking doggedly to the established script, enshrining each last cough and gesture by the now hollow performance, freeze-dried, shrink-wrapped, artfully repackaged itself for English heritage. I will leave it at that. If indeed you want to step over the ropes of this museum piece, there is one book. It is called Enochian Vision Magic by Lon Milo Duquette. It is a fantastic book. It is one of the more fun reading experiences I've ever had, reading a book on magic and a particular kind of magic. I have not read it in years, so I have no idea how great it is still to this day. Yes, that is the place to go if Enochian magic is interesting to you. Suffice to say, let's talk a little bit about some other things, mainly his partner, Edward Kelley. If you can describe somebody in one word, and for some people I think you can, Edward Kelley, his one word is shady. He was 28 years younger than John Dee. He apparently attended Oxford University, but left for some reason. He went by the name Edward Talbot, as he had had his ears clipped, that means cut, due to forgery and counterfeiting. Not much is known of Edward before meeting John Dee. He was certainly not as educated as John Dee. Most people viewed Kelley with a massive amount of suspicion. Upon learning of John Dee's difficulty with scrying, he professed to be a scryer, a claim that many at the time would make, and Dee was impressed with his abilities. So Edward Kelley became his scryer, for better or worse, over a period of years, on again and off again. This was a very troubled relationship, to say the least, between John Dee and Edward Kelley. There would be passages of Dee in his diary merely stating, "Mr. Talbot has left." Kelley was fond of all occult proclivities, including things like the Goetia and alchemy. Many times he did not want to scry with John Dee, saying that it's too much, I can't. Oh, don't force me, John, I can't continue. His alchemy made him notorious and rich in Europe for a time, but his lack of results had him imprisoned several times after John Dee returned to England. Edward Kelley eventually died trying to escape from his prison. The largest obstacle to taking John Dee's work seriously isn't John Dee himself, but it is, in fact, Edward Kelley. The guy stank to high heaven, and I'll get into this a little bit later. Dee's magic didn't come out of nowhere. He was in every way inspired by what was available to him and what came before. Remember his library. He collected books on his paths and his journey through Europe. So some of the texts that were very important to him were such things as the Sworn Book of Honorius, otherwise known as Liber Iuratus. This is a document which has the original Sigillum de Ameth in it. It's a little bit more rudimentary than John Dee's version. It's a strange document with something called the Visio Dei. It's a ceremony, I think it's about a month long, in which if you do the things in the Sworn Book of Honorius, you will have a vision of God. It's very complex. It's very all over the place. Not as complex as Dee's magic, but involving things like sticking swords into the ground. Anyways, it's very strange, but it was very influential. There's also the Heptameron, which was attributed to Peter de Albano. I've talked about it a little bit with Eric on the Arnemancy podcast. It's got angels for every day of the week, as well as a construction of a circle with the names of the angels and the season that you were particularly in, whatever angel and season it's in. This circle changes. An incredibly fascinating document, and I have used it, and it's great. And I won't shut up about how great it is. It's fantastic. Full marks for the Heptameron. The Armadale. The Armadale has a lot of things involving angels and quarters, some directionality there. There is the Almadale, which we think has an Arabic predecessor. The Almadale goes through things like tables. It has equipment, seals of wax, position of all of these things, positions of where you're going to put them. Yeah, it's an interesting document as well. The Ars Paulina, there is a strange tabletop, which has many interesting glyphs and whatnot on it. And also the work of Trithemius of Spondheim. He was a massive influence on John Dee. I'm definitely going to have to do an episode on Trithemius. He was a mentor to Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. He had a writing on angel scrying. It was a fairly short text, but a very influential text. It was later used for the drawing spirits into crystals section in the book The Magus by Francis Barrett. But Trithemius was a major influence, if not probably the biggest influence on John Dee. He also had the Steganographia. This was about coded words, very popular for Dee too. Dee was not the only one seemingly possessed by the idea of angels and angel magic and contacting angels, as before him we have the evidence of Humphrey Gilbert and John Davis, who wrote the excellent book on the art of magic before John Dee did. Gilbert and Dee, they were contemporaries, although they did not like each other very much. Thomas Rudd, who has a treatise on angel magic, which was heavily Dee-influenced, and even he took a lot of what Dee did and changed it for himself in a, I'll just say, a more efficient and it makes more sense to me kind of way. But there's far too much to talk about with Thomas Rudd, and so I won't do it here. But all of these documents and more went into the creation of John Dee's magical system. For a moment, I'd like to talk about scrying. Scrying is a way of calling angels or spirits into either a stone, which is called a show stone, or a crystal of some kind. Think looking into a crystal ball kind of thing, right? Scrying was a big thing in Europe and in England at the time. People proclaimed to have great results from scrying. So how did Dee and his scryers proceed in their magic? Specifically with Edward Kelley, this was done during the day. And sometimes it was not just the two of them. Sometimes there would be John Dee's family running around, his kids or his wife Jane, or he might have had assistants about to get him things when he needed to, like, get me that book from the shelf, that kind of thing. So your idea of, a thunderous, rainy night in a dank attic, that's not entirely correct. Yeah, he did a lot of this, if not all of it, during the day. So what would he do? He would start with prayers, so many prayers, tons, hours and hours of prayers. He would make a case for being unworthy, but that he needed the assistance of the angels. So they would try to sanctify themselves, There would be fasting. There would be abstinence for periods of time. Dee was deeply religious, like incredibly so. I know people at that time were fairly religious anyway. Dee was devoutly religious. Once the prayers were done, Kelley would be asked to stare into the crystal, and Dee would ask questions, and Kelley would answer for the angels and the spirits that appeared within the crystal. So it would be a bit of a back and forth kind of thing. Dee would ask for something, the angels would answer, Dee would maybe try to ask something new or get clarification, and this would happen over a period of hours sometimes, or a period of minutes, depending on if somebody decided to show up in the crystal or the showstone. John Dee would write everything down, everything. He was meticulous at taking notes and his diaries. And it's interesting, if you do find a copy of his spiritual diaries, the footnotes that he puts in a lot of his work is fascinating. It really is. They did this with a very elaborate furniture setup in the room that they were scrying. There was a table of practice that had a very interesting tabletop. The table itself was actually on wax seals, those seals that I mentioned of the Sigillum de Ameth that were made out of wax that you can see in the British Museum. Those were put underneath the legs of the table on which they were working. There were carpets in the room. There were more seals nearby, banners, a gold ring, a lamen, lots of cloths and silks. The scrying implement itself would be put on one of the seals, and I believe that there was over the seal there was some kind of a silk put on that. But that's how they worked, right? And it was through this that they came up with some very strange effects while they were doing it, besides just Edward Kelley answering as the angel or as the spirit. Dee would, every once in a while, he'd see something very, very odd. Kelley would say that he saw something very, very odd. There would be objects appearing, and there was also the thing that everybody is really fascinated by, was the formation of a whole new language, which now we call Enochian. But John Dee didn't. So what were the angels saying? A lot of things. Lots of doom and gloom. The angels were downright apocalyptic in a lot of cases. They also did a lot of chastising of both Dee and Kelley, but more particularly Kelley for doing things like meddling with the Goetia, that kind of stuff. Now, the thing that a lot of people really hone in on is the fact that the angels, they provided predictions for upcoming events. So I want to run through a few of these, and this is not to be cruel in any way, shape, or form. I just want to have a little bit of fun with it. So let's go through some of these predictions, at least the less apocalyptic ones, and see how the angels did. So judges, fingers on buzzers. The first, that Mary, Queen of Scots, was to be executed. Yeah, well done. They definitely predicted that. And to be fair, if you lived at that time, you did not really need an angel to tell you that Mary, Queen of Scots, was going to get aced. It was kind of, everybody knew that it was bound to happen kind of thing. But we'll give it to the angels. The angels, you get that one. That the peculiar peoples will be restored. Now, there is a footnote to this note that John Dee believes that this means that the Jews will be allowed to return to England. The Jews were expelled in England in 1290. So how did the angels do on this one? Yeah, the angels got this one. In 1655, the Jews were allowed to come back to England. And so, yeah, that worked out for them. Something resembling the Spanish Armada would occur. Yep, angels called that. Pretty good. They're pretty good. Oh, they're doing good here. They're 3 for 3. That's excellent. How about this, angels? How about you tell us the validity of the texts that you are giving us to receive at this point? Things like the Book of Soiga or the Sigillum Die. Yeah, the angels didn't really answer these questions, or they evaded them. So that's a maybe. That is a huge maybe. How about the location of hidden treasures? Yeah, they didn't find any hidden treasure, although they didn't really do a very good job of looking. So that's a weird one. How about the location of lost books? There's one book in particular called the Arabic book, which some people have surmised was the Book of Soiga, but I'm pretty sure that it wasn't the Book of Soiga. How did the angels do on this one? Well, the Arabic book was later recovered. It was lost for a little bit in John Dee's huge library, but that was recovered. But the other books, things like the Book of Enoch, they never found that book. They didn't find that book until much later, and it wasn't by John Dee. So that's a weird one. They predicted a lot of political advice, including Albert Lasky being made one of the rulers of Poland. How much the Lord Treasurer knows, if John Dee's reformed calendar, which he did make a reformed calendar and submitted it. How did the angels do here? Yeah, that's a complete no. Albert Lasky's political future was not accurate in any way, shape, or form, and the calendar that John Dee came up was never instituted. So, yeah, sorry. How about the advice for Adrian Gilbert, his way of being able to find the Northwest Passage? Yep, that's a big no. The Northwest Passage was never really a thing. So, sorry. How about that John Dee would live to be 100 years old? Yeah, no, John Dee only lived to about 81 years old. So the angels, they did not do great. I'm just going to put it that way. All right, so let's continue to go through some stuff. Dee was incredibly earnest in his ambitions, and he was inclined to believe everything that was happening around him. The Enochian language and the calls, a lot of times they're used to prove the validity of the interactions that Dee had. It's meant to say that Dee actually literally talked to angels or spirits, despite many skeptics being able to pull them apart with saying things like the language is not very consistent in any way, shape, or form. The syntax itself is basically the syntax of the English language at the time, and that it shares more traits like that of glossolalia. Right? Speaking in tongues kind of thing. So the reception of the calls is the thing that believers point to say that this actually happened, that it is a real thing, as it would require a massive amount of memory for Edward Kelley to be able to pull this off, like a really stunning amount of memory. And there seems certainly better ways of making a living at the time than just memorizing a ton of stuff to be able to tell to an older man who is waiting for you to answer after you've finished staring into a stone. Truth be told, it is very bizarre. There is an article that will be in the show notes that is too detailed to go into here, but it is worthy of a read. Basically, it posits that Kelley really worked at memorizing things that Dee was interested in, and almost as a medium in a way. He was able to bring them forward, and he crafted his own language, basically, which Dee took to be divine. Sometimes people can be both skillful and lucky in equal measure, and this might have been the case with Edward Kelley. Make no mistake, there is still some high weirdness as well as high shadiness to go along with all of this. Dee at one point decided to talk to the angels in Greek. Kelley did not know Greek, or so he said he did not know Greek, and they answered in Greek. There is a part of the conversations which is well known. A lot of people make a lot of noise about this. It's called The Daughter of Fortitude. The Daughter of Fortitude is strange because it reads a lot like a Gnostic text that was found in the 1940s called Thunder Perfect Mind. Daughter of Fortitude goes something like this: I am the daughter of fortitude and ravished every hour from my youth. This is kind of interesting, I think. The Book of Soiga is a strange one because the angels, i.e. Kelley, they were beyond evasive when they were trying to share information about this book. And that is a bit indicative because the Book of Soiga and information about the Book of Soiga, that was basically Edward Kelley's first day on the job as a scryer. So that rings a little bit of alarm bells. Kelley barely spoke Latin at all. And John Dee would ask them questions in Latin quite often. But curiously, the angels' Latin, it got better over time when it was being questioned by John Dee. Strange. The Latin segments themselves that Kelley would say, they're fairly unremarkable in that they're very fixed and they're very curt. It's almost as if they're trying to avoid having any further discourse in Latin. Some more alarm bells there. But much of the information that was supposedly revealed to John Dee from Edward Kelley were straight out of books that we know were in John Dee's library, which Kelley had access to. The very first Sigillum de Ameth was said to be completely correct. Kelley gave it to Dee. He was like, this is it. This is the Sigillum de Ameth. And then Dee kind of said, like, I don't know about that. And the angel said, whoa, hold on. We'll get you another one. At which point, Edward Kelley kind of goes to his room and he corrects it. Sorry, the angels correct it. Yeah, that happened. Many times when the information seems lacking from the angels, they quickly just halt the session with a kind of, I'll get back to you. And then they later have the relevant information that John Dee wanted, which might be indicative of Kelley going and doing some homework before coming back to the session. Yeah. But much of these interactions are that old chestnut of telling somebody what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. Suffice to say, reading through John Dee's material, the constant dance between astonishment and that's just pure bullshit and Kelley is yanking Dee's chain, and his willingness to believe in these interactions, it's dizzying and it's really quite fun. So I suggest reading through John Dee's spiritual diaries if you are inclined and interested. You don't really need to know about Enochian magic too much for it to make sense, although it definitely does help. So that is basically almost all I'm going to say about the magic of John Dee. So let's stay with the message here. What are we left with taking all of John Dee's magic into consideration? Was it all Edward Kelley grifting John Dee? Was it all real? Was every part of it real and really talking to angels? Were parts of it real? Parts of it were made up? Was Edward Kelley insane and just rattling off some really strange information and hoping that it would stick, and luckily it did? I've even heard that it's all a coded message. It's like coded espionage. I've heard that as well. In a way, it doesn't matter. I think the occult scholar Justin Sledge, in his essay Between Loga and Cozening towards an etiology of John Dee's spiritual diaries, is somewhat correct with his assessment that the conditions that led to Dee and Kelley's magic, the neurology of both of them, and the probable insanity of Kelley, the religiosity, the episteme of Tudor England at the time, as well as the complete unwavering belief that Dee had for what he was doing, created the circumstances for a once-in-a-while occurrence not seen since. In a way, and if you'll excuse the pun, the medium was the message. And to hold on to that idea of a medium, I want to flesh out for a second something that I think people might need to understand about this. The process that they went through for these interactions, while arduous, has much to think about. We are missing the point when we want to prove how factual Dee's angelic conversations were. Here's the gist. At least here's my gist. Doing anything involving magic of your own creation and well thought out will yield results. The technique and process are key to the phenomena itself. So let me talk for a moment about something that is a bit close to home. And by home, I mean where I now call home. It's called the Philip Experiment, and it took place in the 70s here in Canada. Spiritualist seances and the phenomena that they provide are extremely interesting, and they have been to people since the 19th century. Things like table moving or table tipping, sounds or knocks appearing in the room where the seances take place, phantom hands appearing, somebody else's face changing entirely, and other, I'm just going to say, ghostly phenomena. That's been something that has been interesting to us for ages. Now, from the get-go, these were tied to the idea that the phenomena comes from the spirits of the dead, that it is them that are doing everything. So in 1972, a spiritualist and paranormal group from Toronto added a bit of a twist. They were going to reach out to somebody that didn't actually exist, and not in the sense that they don't exist anymore as if they're dead. It is that they never existed. From the outset, they created a personality called Philip Aylesford, and they gave him a story, a history filled with real-world occurrences like that of the English Civil War, and fake ones like being friends with King Charles II and being unhappily married. And the people that came up with this idea, they did what they set out to do, and they had immediate results. Results, some would say, that were better than if they had been reaching out to a real person. There is footage that you can find, and I'll try to have it up in the show notes, of them doing this in a live TV studio that I believe belonged to Global Television. If you're Canadian, you'll know what I'm talking about. Everybody else won't. They had this group that would do the Philip experiment, and they recorded the stuff that happened. And it's pretty nutty stuff, but it's what you would expect from seances between the 50s and now, basically. Yeah, it's really interesting. While many explanations have been given as to why this occurred, or why this was occurring, which none of these explanations I find very, very interesting, yet again, the point is missed. The process yields something. The act is seemingly part of the cause. Dee and Kelley created, just as Justin Sledge suggests, and in his own words, a perfect storm of conditions that would far surpass something like the Philip experiment. This is the larger and more interesting point. Now, I hope with my example that people don't think that I'm just trying to explain it away by saying what Dee and Kelley did was the exact same as a spiritualist seance. I'm not saying that at all. Do I believe that John Dee talked to angels with the help of Edward Kelley? No, I do not. There is far too much about Edward Kelley that does not sit right with me, and far too many of the things that he did just scream fraud. But as I just said, this is not the point. It is about observing the phenomena. This is where most people get tripped up. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The what of John Dee and his magic is of far less importance than the how of John Dee's magic. And not the how of how he technically talked to angels, as in the techniques themselves, but the how in how he got to the predicament to believe that magic and his angelic conversations were going to be the most important thing he has ever done. How did John Dee become John Dee? When people think of angel magic, they think John Dee. This is an unintended consequence of having the amount of importance placed on Dee's work and his system. His system has been talked to death, added to and amended time and time again. Probably much of what passes for Dee's magic would be stunningly unfamiliar to Dee. You would show him and he would go, What the fuck is this? What the fuck is this? All right. Whether he would have been proud of what others made of his work is irrelevant, although I have my own opinions. The Enochian process, although they did nothing for me, still yield results for many who attempt them. Sometimes they are the most fruitful magical interactions those who do it will ever have. I think this speaks more to what I talked about earlier. The engagement is the most important part, not the aims or the kind of magic it is. So the message. I'm inspired by John Dee. I do not want to do his magic. To have these experiences wrought from my own process, that is my ambition. I don't want to talk to Dee's angels. I want to talk to my own. Finding the things that influence Dee, the magic he reached to before creating his own, to me seems exceedingly more interesting than what's being passed off as his magic. And so I remain inspired to see what I can do with my own processes, to see what can be wrought. I doubt very much my magic works for others. I would be surprised if it does. But I will continue to share in the hopes that it might inspire in some way. Not in a what exactly did you do, Douglas kind of way, but in a how do you come to want to try? From the beginning, I've wanted others to find their own magic and add the flourishes where necessary and see what happens. This is the legacy of Dee that I want, not a never-ending cavalcade of books explaining how to be John Dee. Magic, if done well, is as it should be. Fuck around and find out. I want to end here with talking about John Dee, the man. Through all of his angelic interactions and his magic, the one thing that always gets obscured is the man. I want to talk about the most important part of John, which is John himself. Like most magical figures who are legendary, how people see them is more indicative of the attributes and the qualities they'd like to almost see within themselves. I don't think I've ever come across a totally comprehensive view of John Dee that shows him for what kind of man he really was. But we get glimpses of him, not only through his diaries, but through the words of others who had things to say about him. Now, this is nothing new. Many will make the case for just how intelligent John Dee was, and he certainly was a dynamo within the realms that he found interesting and worthy of effort. That being said, and going to the original way in which I opened up the show, John Dee was a very foolish man. The occult does strange things when you dabble in it. In some way, it is an almost perfect word for what John Dee was doing, or what other occultists themselves do. Getting into the trenches of the occult to find those hidden things also make you prone and susceptible to having the obvious obscured and hidden from you. Dee's foolishness comes from his absolute sincerity and earnestness to believe that he somehow was receiving messages from the divine, from angels themselves. He was so deep into believing this that he literally gave himself no other options besides than to just completely give up. By that point, his magic had so altered his life in every way that he really gave himself no other choice than the unquestionable need to believe in what he was doing. No doubt he was a man of his time, and the times were very odd, which speaks to what Alan Moore spoke about. He was in it. He was it. The picture of Dee that one gets is not exactly a flattering picture, and leaves one to wonder what motives Dee had in all of his decision-making and all of his objectives. At base, Dee would most likely have been an apocalyptic prophet. Just another one of those. One with a very big library. The reunification of Christianity, the conversion of the Jews to Christianity, the Antichrist's arrival, and many more such things were floating about in the head and directing John Dee in all of his actions. This was much of what Dee brought to the scrying table. Astronomical occurrences, such as the visible appearance of new stars in the night sky, seemed to consistently cause Dee to double down on his beliefs. There is something always odd when one sees everything as relevant, pertinent, and of deeper meaning, which is not to say that there isn't deeper meaning, just that in most cases it is much harder to discern what information is relevant and what isn't. And while we can say that all data is relevant when dealing with magic, it is the importance you put on its relevance that is the point. How relevant do you want the relevant to be? Everything was relevant. Dee lived this way. If everything is relevant, what's not? Dee lived this way so that you don't have to. Admire him, feel sorry for him if you must, do not duplicate. In some respects, my favorite biographies of John Dee, and I've read many, are not the ones that deal exclusively with his magic or put the most importance on his magic. I love it when, in these books, the occult clouds part every once in a while and the sunshine of Dee blazes through. Perhaps besides magic, the only thing more important to John Dee was his family. A widower 3 times, his last wife Jane was beyond patient, and it is very clear John loved her so much. Jane was the one who voiced her frustration at the idea that she would have to sleep with Edward Kelley, and it crushed Dee even more so than many have made it out to believe. The amount of sorrow that John Dee felt when Jane passed away of bubonic plague in Manchester in March of 1604 might as well have been the death of John Dee. His children, all 8 of them, were also beyond important to him. He was survived by 6 of his children, and it is his daughter Catherine, named after his first wife, and his son Arthur, that we know the most about. Catherine cared for John during the last years of his life. Not out of pity, but for the love of the man. Dee must have been very gentle when speaking to his children about what his magic was, for Arthur Dee became an occultist in his own right. Arthur was, for a period of time, one of John Dee's scryers. As for friends, no one has anything bad to say about John Dee, besides the fact that he always seemed occupied in some way. They speak of how tall and slender he was, with kind eyes and a miraculous white beard, one who was always available to help them no matter what, when they needed. John's poverty for most of his life, and how patronage was always elusive, made others pity him more than fear him. He was not the great sorcerer that his colleagues at Cambridge made him out to be oh so long ago. He was a man who meticulously reached his hand out to God, to the hidden that one could not see as it was already so bright, and was left by the end of his life with arm extended still, atrophied muscles, wondering if at any point he had been touched. In John's mind, I think he needed to believe he had been. It was all he had. In my mind, the Fool's Gallery belongs to John. The lessons one can learn through the centuries remain the same. At bottom with magic, you are accountable to yourself and what you believe. I'm sure, stripped of all pretense, John would probably agree. But it wouldn't have stopped him from doing anything differently. Thank you so much for listening. I have some beyond excellent books that go through the life and the magic of John Dee. Some of my favorites, such as Deborah Harkness's John Dee's Conversation with Angels, The Arch-Conjurer of England by Glenn Perry, Enochian Vision Magic by Lonmala Duquette, and many more will be in the show notes that are available at whatmagicisthis.com. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find links to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review on either iTunes or Stitcher or any place that you can. I know the star clicky thing is all well and good, but if you could say a few words about the podcast, that would be greatly appreciated. People really do read the reviews that people leave for podcasts, and it might cause them to start to listen to my show. And I hope that they do. Also, if you love the show, please tell a friend about What Magic Is This. If they're weird and wacky and full of magic like you are, chances are they might enjoy the show, and then they might tell somebody, and then they might tell somebody, and it just becomes this wonderful snowballing thing where eventually I become the most popular magic podcast of all time. If you enjoy the show and you want to help support the show, I have a Patreon. That is at patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. I don't have any tiers besides one, and it's $7 a month. That's the price of a fancy drink. That is the price of 2 bags of chips. That's it. That's all. $7 a month. It gets you exclusive content. I release at least 2 things each and every month. I just released an episode about Hermanubis, who was a Greco-Roman Egyptian god combining Hermes and Anubis. Anyways, people really loved that show. It was really well received and it was great. Also, if you become a patron, you get access to the What Magic Is This Discord server, where we have wonderful people there and there's a lot of really great individuals, and you basically get access to ask me anything in the world, and I try to answer it somewhat quickly. That is available at patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or you could head to What Magic Is This and find any of the Patreon buttons there. Just click that and it will take you to where you need to be. If you don't feel like doing the $7 a month thing, I hear you. I do have a PayPal Me account. If you want to support the show, you can donate anything from $5 to $10 to $20 to $500. Any and all contribution help, and it would be greatly appreciated. It all goes back into doing the podcast, basically. So I've hit a bit of a milestone here for the podcast. I get about 20,000 downloads a month, which means that I can apply for monetization on my podcast. Now, I don't want to do this. This would mean having ads in my podcast for things that I probably don't really want to have ads on my podcast for. It's entirely by my choice. I get it. I'm the one who pushes a button that says, yes, I want to have my podcast monetized, but I don't want to do it in any way, shape, or form. If you feel that you are able, supporting the show is the best way of keeping me from doing this and to keep this podcast as my job. I just want to say, the only reason I brought this up is that I want to say that this podcast, I want to be my life for the next little while, and I can't do that without your support. So if you feel that you were able to support the show, $7 a month, that is all I ask. Patreon is the place to do it, and let's make my dream come true. So that's it. That's another titan of magic, perhaps the titan of Western magic. The most garishly decorated and exhibited portrait in the Fool's Gallery, Dr. John Dee. It's tough because this could have easily been a 6-hour episode, or it could easily have been a 1-hour episode. There is a seal that you can break, specifically when talking about either Enochian magic or the books that John Dee wrote because of the angelic conversations, that if you do break this seal, well, things can get real confusing, they can get real long, and more importantly, they can get real boring. Better to err on the side of just putting out good information that can be followed, and then let those who wish to know more find a direction to go. I hope that in some way I have done this. So that's the show, everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and come on back to what magic is this. We'll stare into the crystal that we call your ear canals and see if we can hear the sounds of God. Until next time, I want you all to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We'll talk at you soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.